The Galactic Military Academy ship Conquest's Edge hung in the void like a dagger carved from obsidian and spite, its hull bristling with enough weaponry to reduce entire star systems to cosmic dust, which, honestly, was exactly the kind of overcompensation you'd expect from a civilization that had built their entire identity around being really, really good at killing things. Commander Keth Bloodfang stood on the observation deck, his massive reptilian frame casting shadows that seemed to writhe with malevolent purpose. At 12 feet tall, and built like a nightmare that had been hitting the gym religiously, Keth represented everything the Nexari species held dear. Overwhelming physical dominance, predatory instincts sharp enough to cut diamond, and a philosophical approach to conflict resolution that could be summarized as hit it until it stops moving, then hit it some more, to be sure. The Nexari had ruled the galactic military hierarchy for over 3,000 years, and they'd done it the old-fashioned way, by being absolutely terrifying in single combat and treating warfare like a particularly violent form of interpretive dance. Their battle doctrine was elegantly simple. Identify enemy, close distance rapidly, apply overwhelming force, repeat until galaxy acknowledges your superiority. It had worked beautifully against every species they'd encountered, right up until they'd met the humans. But we'll get to that particular cosmic joke in a moment. The Cubs show promise, growled Keth's second-in-command, a scarred veteran named Thak, whose voice sounded like gravel being processed through a wood chipper. Young Jek has already mastered the 17 classical killing forms. Keth's chest swelled with paternal pride, which in Nexari physiology involved several terrifying inflation displays that had been known to cause panic attacks in visiting diplomats. His son, Jek, was indeed showing exceptional promise in the traditional arts of warfare. At 15 years old, the young Nexari had already demonstrated the ability to tear through combat drones like they were made of tissue paper and good intentions. The training facility below buzzed with activity as the galaxy's most elite warrior species put their offspring through the traditional paces. The young Hivak, Nex, moved with the eerie precision of their insectoid heritage, each strike calculated to maximize damage while conserving energy for the collective good. The molten-born cub, called Blaze, flickered between states of matter with casual ease, demonstrating the crystalline species' mastery over physical form. And Echo, the young representative of the Null Collective, phased in and out of visible existence while manipulating energy fields that made nearby electronics weep in digital anguish. It was a gathering of the galaxy's most promising young killers, each one bred and trained from birth to carry on their species' proud tradition of solving problems through creative application of violence. The sight would have been genuinely intimidating to anyone who wasn't familiar with the cosmic punchline that was about to unfold. "Commander Bloodfang," came a voice that managed to be both respectful and subtly amused. "Permission to observe today's training exercises?" Keth turned to regard the speaker with the kind of expression usually reserved for discovering something unpleasant stuck to the bottom of one's boot. Captain Milo Henderson stood at regulation attention, his human uniform crisp and his posture respectful. But there was something in his eyes that suggested he was enjoying a private joke that no one else had been invited to share. Humans. By all the ancient gods of war, humans. The latest addition to the galactic community was also, without question, the most baffling. When first contact had been established, the galaxy's military powers had collectively shrugged and filed humanity under minor curiosity. Here was a species that had barely managed to crawl off their homeworld, possessed no significant physical advantages, and whose military technology was roughly equivalent to what most civilizations had been using 3,000 years ago during their own primitive phases. The Nexari High Command had assigned Captain Henderson to their training facility as a gesture of diplomatic courtesy, the kind of empty politeness that powerful civilizations extended to their less impressive neighbors. Let the humans observe their betters, learn what real military prowess looked like, and maybe gain some perspective on just how far they had to go before they could play with the big boys. "Proceed, Captain," Keth rumbled, the words carrying about as much genuine welcome as a funeral invitation. "Try not to interfere with serious military training." Henderson smiled, a peculiarly human expression that somehow managed to convey gratitude, acknowledgement, and something that might have been anticipation all at once. "Of course, Commander. I'm just here to learn." which, as it turned out, was possibly the most accurate thing anyone had said on the Conquest's Edge in months, though not quite in the way anyone expected. The training session proceeded according to ancient tradition. The cubs were put through their paces in individual combat, pack hunting scenarios, and territorial warfare simulations. Each exercise was designed to reinforce the fundamental principles that had served their species well for millennia. Strength conquers weakness, aggression overcomes hesitation, and the strong naturally dominate the weak through superior application of force. Jack Bloodfang excelled in the traditional patterns, his movements flowing from one devastating strike to another, with the kind of lethal grace that made his father's predatory heart sing with pride. The other cubs were equally impressive within their species' specializations, Nex demonstrating the Hivac Collective's hive mind tactical coordination, Blaze showcasing Molten Born, adaptability, and Echo proving that energy manipulation could be just as devastating as physical force. It was all very impressive, very traditional, and very predictable. Captain Henderson watched from his assigned observation post, making occasional notes on a device that looked primitive compared to the advanced technology surrounding him. To the casual observer, he appeared to be dutifully recording the obvious superiority of established military doctrine for later study by his less advanced species. The training session concluded with the cubs being dismissed for their rest period, during which they typically reviewed their performance and received wisdom from their elders about the proper conduct of warfare. It was during this interlude that something unprecedented happened. "Excuse me, Captain Henderson." The voice belonged to Jack, who had approached the human's observation post with the kind of curiosity that immediately put every adult Nexari in the vicinity on high alert. Henderson looked up from his notes with the mild expression of someone who had been hoping for exactly this kind of interaction. "Yes, Jack? Something I can help you with?" "We were wondering," Jack began, then paused as the other cubs gathered around him with expressions of shared curiosity. "About human military training. Do your young warriors learn the same patterns we do?" The question sent a ripple of condescending amusement through the nearby adults. Human military training? The idea that a species that had only recently achieved faster-than-light travel could have anything meaningful to contribute to military education was, well, it was adorable, really. Henderson's smile broadened slightly. "Actually, human children do engage in warfare training, but it's a bit different from what you're used to here." "Different how?" This question came from Nex, whose compound eyes glittered with the kind of intellectual curiosity that made Hivac such effective information gatherers. "Well," Henderson said, settling into a more comfortable position, "we call them games." The word landed in the conversation like a small explosive device. Games? The cubs exchanged glances that ranged from confusion to intrigue, while the nearby adults struggled to process the concept of military training being described as recreational activity. "Games?" Echo's voice carried the harmonic undertones that made null communication so unsettling to other species. "You mean competitive activities?" "Exactly," Henderson confirmed. "Human children play war games for fun. They compete against each other using strategies and tactics, but instead of real combat, they use simulated scenarios designed to test different kinds of thinking." Commander Bloodfang, who had been listening to this exchange with growing disbelief, finally interjected. "You mean to tell us that your species treats military preparation as entertainment?" Henderson turned to face the massive Nexari commander with an expression of perfect diplomatic innocence. "Oh, absolutely, Commander. Human kids have been playing war games for thousands of years. Some of our most effective military strategies actually originated in children's games." The statement hung in the air like a bad smell at a diplomatic reception. The idea that anything militarily significant could emerge from juvenile recreational activity was so fundamentally alien to established galactic military thinking that most of the adults present couldn't even begin to process it. But the cubs were fascinated. "What kind of games?" Jack pressed, his predatory instincts telling him that there was something important hidden in this conversation. Henderson glanced around at the gathered young aliens, then at their parents, and made a decision that would shortly turn several millennia of military tradition into cosmic compost. "Well," he said, "since you're on a break anyway, maybe I could show you a few examples? Nothing serious, just some of the simpler games human children play. The adults exchanged glances that conveyed various mixtures of amusement, tolerance, and the kind of benevolent condescension usually reserved for watching particularly cute but dim-witted pets attempt complex tasks. If the human wanted to waste his time teaching their cubs about primitive recreational activities, where was the harm? It might even provide some entertaining anecdotes to share at the next officers' gathering. "Proceed, Captain," Keth rumbled magnanimously. "But keep it brief. The cubs have real training to complete." Henderson's smile took on a quality that, had the Nexari commander been more familiar with human expressions, might have triggered his predatory warning systems. "Of course, Commander. This won't take long at all." And with those words, Captain Milo Henderson began the process of accidentally revolutionizing galactic military doctrine, one children's game at a time. What happened next would have made Sun Tzu himself stand up and applaud. Assuming the ancient Chinese strategist could have comprehended the sheer cosmic audacity of teaching advanced alien predators the finer points of playground warfare. Henderson cleared a space in the training area and gestured for the cubs to gather around. The adults settled into their observation positions with the relaxed attention of parents watching their children play with educational toys, mildly interested, fundamentally confident that nothing truly significant was about to occur. "The first game we'll look at," Henderson began, "is called Capture the Flag. The basic concept is simple. 2 teams, each with a flag to defend and an enemy flag to capture. The team that brings the enemy flag back to their base wins." Jack's reptilian features scrunched into an expression of confusion. "That sounds like standard territorial warfare. Where's the game part?" Henderson's grin widened. "The game part is in the rules. See, in traditional territorial warfare, you'd probably just throw your strongest warriors at the enemy position until one side was completely destroyed. But in Capture the Flag, victory doesn't require eliminating the enemy. It requires achieving a specific objective while preventing them from achieving theirs." Nex's compound eyes glittered with sudden interest. "So the focus shifts from destruction to objective completion?" "Exactly. Which means the optimal strategy changes completely. Sometimes the best way to win isn't to fight the enemy directly, but to manipulate them into fighting someone else, or to make them think you're attacking from one direction while you're actually coming from another, or to convince them that you're not a threat at all while you walk right past their defenses." The cubs exchanged glances that their parents interpreted as polite confusion, but which were actually the first stirrings of strategic revelation. "Let me show you another one," Henderson continued, pulling out what appeared to be a simple handheld device. "This simulates a game we call Among Us. In this scenario, you have a group of individuals working together on a ship, but some of them are secretly saboteurs trying to eliminate the others without being detected." Blaze flickered between states of matter, a sign of agitation in his species. "So, it's about identifying and eliminating traitors?" "Well, yes and no," Henderson said, and the way he said it made several of the observing adults suddenly pay closer attention. "The interesting part isn't the elimination, it's the social manipulation. The saboteurs win not by being the strongest or most skilled fighters, but by being the most convincing liars. They eliminate their targets through deception, misdirection, and by turning the group's paranoia against itself." Echo's harmonic voice carried a note of fascination. "You're describing psychological warfare." "Among children," Henderson confirmed cheerfully. "Human kids have been practicing advanced psychological manipulation techniques since before they could properly pronounce psychological manipulation." Commander Bloodfang shifted uncomfortably in his observation position. Something about this conversation was beginning to trigger instincts he didn't entirely understand, but his rational mind dismissed the feeling. These were children's games the human was describing. Recreational activities. There was no way they could have genuine military applications. Henderson, meanwhile, was just getting started. "Then there's Battle Royale formats," he continued, "where instead of fixed teams, it's every player for themselves, but temporary alliances form and dissolve based on strategic advantage. The arena gradually shrinks, forcing players into closer contact and more intense conflicts. The key is knowing exactly when to cooperate and when to betray your temporary allies." Jack's predatory instincts were now fully engaged. You're teaching children to form strategic alliances and then break them for personal advantage. Of course! It's essential strategic thinking. In a battle royale scenario, the player who wins isn't necessarily the strongest or most skilled. It's the one who best understands social dynamics, resource management, and strategic timing. Sometimes you win by helping your biggest threat eliminate themselves. The human pulled up another simulation on his device. And this one simulates what we call asymmetric warfare. Small groups using guerrilla tactics against larger, more conventional forces. The smaller force wins not by matching the enemy's strength, but by turning that strength into a liability. Nex leaned forward, her compound eyes reflecting the light from Henderson's device. How do you turn strength into a liability? Oh, there are dozens of ways, Henderson said, with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. You can use the enemy's size against them. Larger forces are less maneuverable, require more resources, and create bigger targets. You can exploit their predictability. Conventional forces tend to follow established patterns, which makes them easier to anticipate and counter. You can turn their own firepower against them through careful positioning and misdirection. He gestured to another display. Or you can use what we call information warfare. Instead of attacking the enemy directly, you attack their ability to understand what's happening around them. Feed them false information, disrupt their communications, create confusion about your actual capabilities and intentions. Blaze's crystalline form pulsed with excitement. You're describing ways to defeat superior forces through intelligence rather than strength. Intelligence, creativity, and what humans call thinking outside the box, Henderson confirmed. See, the thing about traditional military doctrine is that it assumes both sides are playing by the same rules. But what happens when one side decides to ignore those rules entirely? The question hung in the air like a challenge to every military tradition the galaxy had ever developed. The cubs were now leaning forward with expressions of intense concentration, while the adults had begun to shift uncomfortably, without quite understanding why. Henderson sensed he had their complete attention and decided to go for broke. Let me show you one more concept, he said, calling up a new simulation. This one we call social engineering in real-time strategy. The objective isn't to defeat your enemies through combat, but to convince them to defeat themselves. How? The question came from all four cubs simultaneously, creating a harmony of alien voices that would have been beautiful if it hadn't been so ominous. By understanding what they want, and then making them think they can get it by doing exactly what you need them to do, Henderson explained. For example, if you know your enemy values honor above victory, you create situations where their honorable choices lead to their strategic defeat. If they prioritize protecting their resources, you make them choose between saving their resources and achieving their objectives. Echo's energy form flickered with something that might have been admiration. You manipulate their decision-making process. Exactly. The beauty of social engineering is that the enemy defeats themselves while thinking they're making smart, tactical choices. They never realize they're being manipulated because the manipulation is built into options that seem perfectly reasonable from their perspective. Jack was now staring at Henderson with the kind of expression his father usually reserved for particularly impressive displays of carnage. These are all strategies that human children learn? Oh, these are just the basics, Henderson said with cheerful modesty. Human kids have been developing increasingly sophisticated versions of these concepts for generations. We've got games that simulate economic warfare, technological espionage, diplomatic manipulation, cultural subversion. You name it. Some human child has probably figured out how to turn it into a competitive recreational activity. The silence that followed this statement was the kind of silence usually associated with funeral homes and tax audits. The cubs were staring at Henderson with expressions of dawning comprehension, while the adults were beginning to experience the first faint stirrings of what might charitably be called concern. Commander Bloodfang cleared his throat with a sound like a landslide in a gravel pit. Captain Henderson, surely you're not suggesting that these recreational activities have genuine military applications? Henderson looked up at the massive Nexari commander with an expression of perfect innocence. Oh, not at all, Commander. These are just games that human children play for fun. though I suppose it's interesting that many of our most effective military strategies did evolve from these same recreational activities over the centuries. Another uncomfortable silence descended on the group. The adults were struggling to process the implications of what they'd just heard, while the cubs were clearly processing it all too well. "Could you?" Jack began hesitantly. "Could you show us more of these games?" Henderson glanced around at the assembled adults, who were now watching him with expressions ranging from bewilderment to growing unease. Then back at the cubs, who were radiating the kind of focused intensity that usually preceded either breakthrough discoveries or spectacular disasters. "Well," he said thoughtfully, "I suppose we could set up a few simple simulations during your free time. Nothing elaborate, just some basic scenarios to demonstrate the concepts." "That would be acceptable," Commander Bloodfang rumbled, though his tone suggested he was beginning to suspect that nothing about this situation was particularly acceptable. And so began what would later be remembered as either the most brilliant or most catastrophic military education program in galactic history, depending entirely on which side of it you happen to be standing. Over the following weeks, Captain Henderson introduced the cubs to increasingly sophisticated examples of human strategic thinking. They learned about resource manipulation games, where victory came from controlling supply lines rather than territory. They mastered scenarios involving technological disruption, where inferior equipment could defeat superior forces through creative application. They discovered the joy of communications warfare, where controlling information flow was more important than controlling physical space. Each lesson was presented as a harmless recreational activity, and each lesson fundamentally challenged every assumption the cubs had ever been taught about the nature of conflict. The adults, meanwhile, noticed that their offspring had become secretive, spending their free time in hushed conversations and mysterious group activities. But since the cubs were still performing well in their traditional training exercises, the change was dismissed as typical adolescent behavior. Commander Bloodfang did notice that his son had begun asking unusual questions during their private training sessions. Questions about enemy psychology, about resource allocation, about the predictability of traditional military doctrine. But these seemed like signs of intellectual development rather than revolutionary thinking, so he answered them with paternal pride. None of the adults realized that their children were systematically deconstructing every military tradition their civilizations had ever developed and rebuilding them according to principles that would have made Machiavelli weep with joy. The cubs, for their part, were having the time of their lives. For the first time in their young lives, they were learning about warfare that relied on intelligence rather than instinct, creativity rather than conditioning, and strategic thinking rather than simply applying overwhelming force until the problem went away. And all of it was presented as games. Fun, recreational activities that just happened to be revolutionizing their understanding of conflict on a fundamental level. By the time the annual Rite of Combat Readiness approached, the cubs had absorbed enough human strategic doctrine to staff a military academy. They had practiced scenarios involving deception, misdirection, psychological manipulation, resource warfare, information control, and social engineering. Their parents, however, remained blissfully unaware that their children had just received the equivalent of several advanced degrees in unconventional warfare theory, which was going to make the upcoming combat trials considerably more interesting than anyone had anticipated. The annual Rite of Combat Readiness approached with all the pomp and circumstance that galactic warrior civilizations could muster, which is to say, it involved enough ceremonial weaponry to arm a small moon and sufficient dramatic posturing to power a theater district for a year. For 3 millennia, the rite had followed the same time-honored traditions. The cubs would face seasoned adult warriors in a series of controlled combat scenarios designed to test their mastery of classical military doctrine. The adults would demonstrate superior experience and tactical knowledge while allowing the youngsters to show their developing skills. Everyone would learn valuable lessons about courage, honor, and the proper application of overwhelming force. The cubs would gain respect for their elders' wisdom, and the adults would identify which youngsters were ready for advanced training. It was all very civilized, very predictable, and very satisfying to everyone involved. Commander Bloodfang stood in the Central Command Chamber, reviewing the traditional scenarios with his fellow officers. The massive holographic display showed the testing ground, a simulated planetary surface complete with varied terrain, strategic resources, and multiple objectives, perfect for demonstrating classical military principles to the next generation. The youngsters have requested something unusual this year, rumbled General Thack, his scarred features creasing into what might have been amusement. Instead of individual combat trials, they want to engage in large-scale tactical simulation. Bloodfang's predatory instincts stirred with mild interest. Group tactics? That's ambitious for cubs their age. Perhaps they feel ready for more advanced challenges, suggested Admiral Vex, the Hivak representative whose compound eyes glittered with species-typical analytical precision. My offspring Nex has been demonstrating unusual strategic curiosity lately. Captain Dorn of the Moltenborn flickered through several states of matter in what passed for thoughtful consideration among his people. Young Blaze has also been asking peculiar questions about conventional warfare doctrine. Perhaps exposure to human recreational activities has stimulated their intellectual development. The mention of Henderson brought knowing chuckles from the assembled officers. The humans' harmless little games had indeed kept the cubs entertained and out of the way during serious training. If it had also sparked some intellectual curiosity, so much the better. Very well, Bloodfang declared with magnanimous authority. We'll accommodate their request. A planetary conquest scenario should provide ample opportunity to demonstrate proper military principles. The parameters were established with casual confidence. The adult warriors would take the role of an invasion force tasked with securing key strategic locations across the simulated planet. The cubs would defend these positions using whatever resources and tactics they deemed appropriate. The scenario would run until either the adults achieved their objectives or the cubs successfully repelled the Ru invasion for a predetermined time limit. The adults expected to complete their objectives within a few hours at most. After all, they possessed superior numbers, advanced tactical training, sophisticated equipment, and millennia of accumulated military wisdom. The cubs had enthusiasm and developing skills, which was admirable, but hardly sufficient to challenge seasoned warriors operating according to proven doctrine. What could possibly go wrong? Henderson watched the pre-scenario briefings from his assigned observation post, maintaining the carefully neutral expression he'd perfected over weeks of diplomatic interactions. To the casual observer, he appeared to be preparing to document another demonstration of established galactic military superiority for later analysis by his less advanced species. In reality, he was trying very hard not to grin like a maniac. The cubs had spent their preparation time in intensive strategy sessions that bore no resemblance whatsoever to traditional military planning. Instead of discussing honor, courage, and proper combat formations, they'd been engaged in conversations that would have made intelligence agency professionals weep with professional admiration. Jack had developed what he cheerfully called psychological warfare protocols, based on his detailed analysis of adult behavioral patterns. Nex had created information management strategies that turned the Hivak collective mind capabilities toward intelligence gathering and disinformation campaigns. Blaze had devised resource manipulation tactics that used Moltenborn shape-shifting abilities for purposes their elders had never imagined. And Echo had figured out how to weaponize null energy manipulation for electronic warfare applications that weren't even theoretical yet in most galactic militaries. They'd also done something unprecedented in the history of galactic military exercises. They'd formed a genuine interspecies tactical alliance based on complementary capabilities rather than traditional hierarchical structures. The scenario begins in 30 minutes, announced the exercise coordinator, a by-the-book Nexari officer whose entire career had been built on flawless execution of standard procedures. All participants report to designated starting positions. The adult warriors moved to their deployment zones with the practiced efficiency of professional soldiers executing familiar routines. They checked their equipment, reviewed their objectives, and coordinated their approach according to tactics that had proven effective across countless campaigns. The cubs, meanwhile, had vanished. Not literally, of course. The exercise monitoring systems tracked all participants at all times, but they'd scattered across the simulation environment in patterns that made no sense according to conventional military deployment doctrine. Instead of establishing defensive positions around the strategic objectives they were supposed to protect, they'd spread out in seemingly random locations that appeared to serve no tactical purpose whatsoever. Curious deployment pattern, observed General Thack, studying the tactical display with mild puzzlement. Perhaps they're planning some kind of guerrilla defense strategy? Possibly, Bloodfang agreed. though something about the Cubs' positioning was triggering instincts he couldn't quite identify. No matter. Unconventional tactics won't compensate for inexperience when facing superior force applied with proper coordination. The exercise timer reached 0, and the rite of combat readiness officially began. The adult warriors launched their assault with textbook precision. Multiple coordinated strikes against primary objectives, diversionary attacks to split defensive attention, overwhelming force applied at strategic pressure points. It was a masterful demonstration of classical military doctrine, executed with the kind of professional competence that had maintained galactic stability for millennia. For approximately 18 minutes, everything proceeded exactly as expected. The adults advanced against minimal resistance, secured preliminary objectives on schedule, and began implementing Phase 2 of their assault plan with the confidence of warriors whose tactics had been tested and proven across countless conflicts. Then something began to go wrong, though none of them could quite identify what it was. Communications became unreliable. Not completely disrupted, that would have triggered immediate countermeasures, but subtly degraded in ways that made coordination increasingly difficult. Orders were received with slight delays, confirmations came back with minor inconsistencies, and tactical updates arrived with timing that was just off enough to create cumulative confusion. Equipment began experiencing mysterious malfunctions. Not catastrophic failures that would clearly indicate enemy action, but frustrating little problems that degraded performance without creating obvious targets for retaliation. Weapon systems developed targeting glitches. Vehicles experienced navigation anomalies, and sensor arrays started providing data that was technically accurate, but somehow misleading. Most unsettling of all, the enemy seemed to be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The Cubs' positions on the tactical display kept shifting in patterns that made no logical sense, appearing in locations they shouldn't have been able to reach, and vanishing from places where they should have been trapped. "What exactly are they doing?" demanded Admiral Vex, her compound eyes reflecting growing frustration, as she studied displays that showed her forces making steady progress toward objectives that somehow remained tantalizingly out of reach. "Unclear," Bloodfang admitted, his predatory instincts now screaming warnings that his rational mind couldn't interpret. "Their tactics don't match any established doctrine." Captain Dorn flickered rapidly through several states of matter, a sign of agitation in his species. "My forces report engaging enemy positions that turn out to be decoys, while the real threats appear behind our advance elements. It's as if they know our tactical plans better than we do." General Thack studied the tactical displays with the growing unease of a professional soldier watching familiar patterns break down for reasons he couldn't understand. "They're not fighting us directly. They're manipulating the engagement somehow." Henderson, observing from his assigned position, finally allowed himself a small smile. The Cubs had absorbed their lessons well. Very well indeed. On the simulated battlefield below, Jack was putting his psychological warfare protocols into action by feeding carefully crafted misinformation through captured communication channels. Every piece of intelligence his father's forces received was technically true, but strategically misleading, creating a comprehensive picture of enemy capabilities and intentions that would lead to exactly the wrong tactical decisions. Nex had deployed the HIVAC Collective Mind Network as a real-time intelligence gathering and analysis system, monitoring adult communications and behavioral patterns to predict their actions with uncanny accuracy. The Cubs always seemed to know what the adults were planning, because, in a very literal sense, they did know. Blaze was using molten-born shape-shifting abilities to create false targets, phantom threats, and strategic misdirections that kept adult forces reacting to dangers that didn't exist, while ignoring the actual threats that were systematically dismantling their tactical coherence. And Echo had turned null energy manipulation into an electronic warfare weapon that disrupted enemy systems so subtly that the targets never realized they were under attack. Equipment malfunctioned in ways that seemed like random technical failures. Communications degraded through apparently natural interference, and sensor systems provided misleading data that appeared to be accurate readings of false targets. Working together, the Cubs had created a tactical environment where every adult advantage was systematically neutralized through methods that fell outside the boundaries of conventional military thinking. The adults found themselves fighting an enemy that refused to engage according to rules they understood, while operating in an information environment they couldn't trust, using equipment that no longer functioned as expected. And the Cubs were just getting started. "Sir," reported a communications officer whose voice carried the barely controlled panic of someone watching carefully ordered systems collapse into chaos. "We're receiving conflicting intelligence reports. Our equipment reliability is degrading across all systems, and enemy positions continue to shift in patterns that violate basic tactical logic." Commander Bloodfang stared at the tactical displays with growing disbelief. His forces were making progress toward their objectives, but it was progress that felt wrong somehow. Every success seemed to create new problems. Every advance opened vulnerabilities he couldn't quite identify, and every tactical decision led to consequences that made perfect sense individually, but somehow added up to strategic incoherence. "What in the name of the ancient war gods are they doing down there?" he muttered, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been awe. Henderson, still maintaining his carefully neutral expression, had an answer for that question. But he suspected that Commander Bloodfang wasn't quite ready to hear it yet. What happened next would be discussed in galactic military academies for the next 1,000 years, assuming anyone could figure out how to explain it without sounding completely insane. The adult warriors, despite their growing confusion, pressed forward with their assault. They were professionals, after all, and professionals adapt to changing circumstances. If the Cubs were using unconventional tactics, well, unconventional tactics had been tried before and defeated through superior discipline and firepower. This confidence lasted approximately another 23 minutes. The breaking point came when Admiral Vex's HIVAC forces finally reached what appeared to be a major strategic objective, only to discover that they'd been systematically herded into a kill zone that shouldn't have existed according to any tactical analysis they'd performed. The position they'd fought so hard to secure turned out to be worthless. The intelligence that had led them there was completely fabricated, and their communications with other units had been so thoroughly compromised that they'd been fighting the wrong battle entirely. "How did they know we would choose this approach?" Vex demanded over increasingly unreliable communication channels. The answer, had she been able to hear it, was elegantly simple. Because Nex had spent weeks studying adult tactical patterns and had literally predicted every decision the HIVAC forces would make based on their species' psychological profile and established doctrine. Meanwhile, Captain Dorn's Molten-born units found themselves in the embarrassing position of having spent an hour fighting what they thought were enemy positions, only to discover they'd been engaged in combat with sophisticated decoys, while the real Cubs systematically dismantled their supply lines and communication networks. General Thak's forces had managed to secure 2 strategic objectives, but somehow this had only made their tactical situation worse, as holding these positions required resources they no longer possessed and created vulnerabilities they couldn't defend against threats they couldn't predict. And Commander Bloodfang was beginning to experience something he hadn't felt in over 30 years of military service: the cold certainty that he was being outmaneuvered by an opponent whose capabilities he fundamentally misunderstood. "Status report," he demanded, his voice carrying the kind of authority that had cowed enemies across half the galaxy. "Sir," came the response from his tactical coordinator, "we've achieved 60% of our primary objectives, but our force cohesion is degrading rapidly. Enemy tactics continue to fall outside established parameters." "Be more specific." "Sir, they're not fighting us. They're manipulating us. Every engagement we initiate serves their strategic purposes rather than ours. Every position we secure becomes a liability. Every tactical decision we make appears to be anticipated and countered before we complete implementation." Bloodfang studied the holographic displays with the growing realization that something unprecedented was happening. The tactical situation made no sense according to any military doctrine he'd ever studied, but the results were undeniable. His forces were being systematically defeated by opponents who shouldn't have possessed the capability to challenge them. And then Jack's voice came through the communication system with the kind of cheerful politeness that immediately triggered every parental warning instinct Bloodfang possessed. "Father, we've completed our primary objectives. Would you like to discuss terms for your withdrawal, or shall we proceed to demonstrate advanced tactical applications?" The silence that followed this transmission was the kind of silence usually associated with natural disasters and tax investigations. Every adult in the command center stared at the displays with expressions ranging from disbelief to existential crisis. "What primary objectives?" Bloodfang finally managed. "Oh, the usual," Jack replied with casual cheerfulness. "Neutralize your tactical advantage, disrupt your force coordination, manipulate your decision-making process, and demonstrate the superiority of adaptive strategic thinking over rigid doctrine. Mission accomplished, basically." The words hit the command center like a tactical nuclear device wrapped in diplomatic courtesy. "You mean to tell me," Bloodfang said slowly, "that your objective was not to defend strategic positions, but to defeat our assault entirely?" "Well, yes," Jack confirmed. "Captain Henderson explained that the best way to win a conflict is to change the nature of the conflict itself. So instead of playing defense according to your rules, we decided to play offense according to human rules." Henderson, watching from his observation post, finally abandoned all pretense of diplomatic neutrality and allowed himself to grin like someone who'd just watched his favorite chess master execute a particularly brilliant gambit. Admiral Vex's voice crackled through the communication system with the kind of controlled hysteria that suggested someone's worldview was currently exploding. "Human rules? What exactly are human rules?" "Oh, you know," Echo's harmonic voice joined the conversation. "Asymmetric warfare, psychological, manipulation, information control, social engineering, technological disruption, resource management, and strategic deception. The basics, really." "Those are advanced military sciences," General Thack protested, "not recreational activities for children." "That's the funny thing about humans," Nex's voice added, with what sounded suspiciously like amusement. "They don't really distinguish between the two. Their children learn advanced strategic thinking by playing games that would challenge most military academies." Blaze's contribution flickered through the speakers, with barely contained excitement. "Captain Henderson taught us that the most effective way to defeat a superior enemy is to make them defeat themselves. So we created conditions where your superior force became a strategic liability instead of an advantage." The tactical displays suddenly shifted to show the real situation on the battlefield. The Cubs hadn't just defended against the adult assault. They'd systematically dismantled it while making the adults believe they were winning right up until the moment they'd already lost. Every adult tactical decision had been predicted, manipulated, and turned against them. Every advantage they'd possessed had been neutralized through methods that fell completely outside their understanding of warfare. Every move they'd made had served the Cubs' strategic objectives while undermining their own. It was a masterpiece of strategic thinking that would have impressed military theorists across the galaxy if they could have understood how 4 adolescent aliens had managed to execute it flawlessly against seasoned professional warriors. Commander Bloodfang stared at the displays for a long moment, his predatory instincts finally catching up with what his rational mind had been trying to ignore. His son hadn't just defeated him. His son had revolutionized the nature of conflict itself, and then demonstrated that revolution by making thousands of years of military tradition look like children playing with toy soldiers. "Captain Henderson," Bloodfang said quietly, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been respect. "Perhaps we should discuss expanding our military exchange program." Henderson's smile broadened into something that would have terrified enemy intelligence agencies across several star systems. "Well, Commander, that was just the kids' games. Wait until you see what our adults have been working on." The silence that followed this statement was profound enough to register on seismographic equipment. Every warrior in the command center was suddenly, urgently, desperately interested in learning exactly what kind of species produced children who treated advanced military strategy as recreational entertainment. And somewhere in the back of their minds, a small voice was asking a very uncomfortable question. If human children could do this to experienced galactic warriors using games they played for fun, what exactly could human adults do with military strategies they'd developed for actual warfare? The galaxy, it seemed, was about to find out whether humanity's reputation for being harmlessly primitive was the greatest underestimation in cosmic history, or the most brilliant strategic deception ever executed. Either way, nobody was ever going to underestimate human military potential again.